Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation here today is Mr. Mark Squeglia. Mark's no stranger to the Jefferson stage, as many of you might recall his various programs rooted in history, particularly focusing on World War II, which he's been offering at the Jefferson since 2010. Mark is a graduate from Gannon University in 1979 with a degree in history. He went on to work for Hammermill Paper Company, Erie Insurance, Presque Isle Insurance, and General Electric. Currently, he works for Linium, a software consulting firm. Mark was also a member of the Perry 200 Commission. And while Mark's interests are in all periods of history, as we noted, he focuses specifically on military history and World War II history. He also serves currently as the secretary of the board of directors at the Hagen History Center. But history isn't what brings Mark here with us today, although we do hope that he'll join us for one of those programs soon in the future. Mark is here today to talk about something he's been doing for quite some time that's become a new reality to a lot of us nowadays with the COVID-19 crisis, working remotely and managing coworkers remotely and other workers remotely as well. 5 years ago, it was estimated that just shy of 4 million people were working remotely in the United States. Over the course of the past 5 years, that number is now closer to 8 million, with workplaces becoming digital spaces. But as we've seen in the recent few weeks, the impacts of COVID-19 and social distancing and shelter-in-place directives from healthcare officials at the local, state, and national levels, many workers who are not on the front lines of the crisis found themselves suddenly working from their spare bedroom, makeshift office in the basement, or even the couch or the bed. In this program, we're going to discuss that, working remotely before and during COVID-19 crisis. We're going to talk about the tech, best practices, how to be productive, and when pants are required. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, please just leave it in the comment section below, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. If you're watching the later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions, and we'll get them to Mark, along to Mark as best as we can. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website at www.jeserie.org and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Mark, welcome back to the Digital Jefferson.
Thanks, Ben. Good to be back, although I didn't think it would be in this manner.
Well, and I didn't think you'd be coming to us live from San Francisco. So can you tell us a little bit about why you chose the background there?
My wife and I had a planned trip to Sonoma. We were going to spend a week in wine country. This trip had been planned for quite some time, but as we all know, with the COVID-19 crisis, those plans have been changed. So I found this background on Zoom and I thought it was appropriate.
So you're there in spirit, and hopefully you and the wife will get to Sonoma soon, and hopefully soon we'll have you back at the Jefferson for a live program. But for now, we are so grateful that you're able to join us here via Zoom and on Facebook Live as we're running now. Hard-hitting question to start with, Mark. A lot of these digital interviews now focus on it. Have you cut your own hair yet?
Well, as you can see, I don't have that issue. I don't need to. So that's not been a problem.
But you're still shaving regularly. This is my COVID beard. I'm trying to hold on to it as long as I can, as safely as I can. But
I last about 4 days without shaving, and then I got to shave.
More seriously, though, Mark, we're here to talk about working remotely. For many of us, this is a new experience, uncharted waters, and we're finding organizations and workers trying to adapt to those times, those that can continue to do their work remotely. And I know a lot of my friends are included in that. And so we're looking for some help. But give us a sense, how long have you been at this?
I've been working remotely 14, 15 years. Started doing it in 2006 when I was working for GE Transportation.
So did you choose this or did it choose you? How did that all start? Because you were, I mentioned earlier in my intro, 5 years ago, it was a pretty small number, 3 million. We've more than doubled or close to doubling that now. You seem to be a trendsetter. Did you choose it or did it choose you?
Actually, it chose me. General Electric roles and responsibilities within the organization and people reporting to certain businesses moved quite frequently. And a lot of times those moves didn't require a location move. So in 2006, I moved from working for GE Transportation to GE Energy. And it wasn't by choice, I was just reassigned. Come to find out when I got reassigned that my manager was in Atlanta and the team members that I worked with were scattered across the country. So that's how it all started. It was a little different though, because I continued to locate myself at the plant over on 12th Street, or at the end of 12th Street. So I was working from a GE facility, but the people that I worked with, none of them were located in Erie. So for all intents and purposes, I was remote.
So since it chose you and you didn't choose it, what were your first reactions 15 years ago? Did you welcome it? Were you apprehensive? And the follow-up to that is, when did it start to feel normal for you?
I was apprehensive at the beginning. I was apprehensive on a couple of things. Number one, not being co-located with the team that I was working with, but also the person I was reporting to, the manager that I was working for. That apprehension disappeared very quickly because the manager that I worked for had been working remotely as well. So he understood the challenges of working remotely. And kind of a humorous story, prior to being transferred to GE Energy, I worked for somebody at GE Transportation who I probably saw maybe once every 3 weeks. When I went to work for GE Energy and worked for the manager in Atlanta, I talked to him more than I talked to my wife. So he really made an effort, and a lot of the suggestions that I'm going to probably bring forward in the presentation are from that initial engagement and working for that manager, who made working remotely successful and actually taught me how to work remotely as well. So.
Well, I wanted to get to a big bottom line up front, and I think you really hit on it there with some of the initial challenges, being you're not with the team and you're used to physically being with the team, and then one of the benefits, you went from not seeing your supervisor often to then seeing them more digitally, and so just bottom line up front, for folks looking for the immediate takeaway, what are the biggest benefits of working remotely, and what do you see the biggest challenges? And we'll unpack those as we go through the presentation, but
Sure.
just bottom line up front, what do you think?
Well, I think the biggest benefit of working remotely is the elimination of distractions, elimination of the water cooler talk, elimination of somebody walking into your office. So it's productivity. You can really focus as much as you want on the task at hand. Now you have to have the discipline to do that, but that's another issue, another story.
I was
The
going to say,
biggest,
I want to be able to get into that because you said distractions, and I think at home, I've got plenty of those distractions. It might not be a water cooler, but it's the couch and Netflix, or it's the refrigerator,
it
or
is,
it's
it
taking the
is.
dog for the sixth walk of the day. So
Yeah, I
maybe,
mean, on the challenge side, communication obviously is the challenge. And you're right, it's the availability of too much food, um, which is a challenge. So, um,
So, Mark, one of the first things that most of us think about when we think about working remotely, and here we are having a Jefferson program using Zoom, broadcasting live onto Facebook, at which a later date we'll put onto YouTube, so that folks can access it. We think about technology, and that's one of the first things that comes to mind. Walk us through the different technologies that you find to be effective, the use of them, just some overviews, and how those have maybe changed over time. Give us that 15-year perspective of, how it's become easier or more challenging as we introduce more tech.
okay, I'm going to share a couple of slides, Ben.
That's great. For those watching along at home, Mark's got a PowerPoint that he's going to run through, and so we're going to be able to follow along with his screen. So you'll see us in the upper right-hand corner. We're going to try to not obscure too much of that PowerPoint. But you'll be able to see us as he continues to go through that PowerPoint presentation. Mark, thanks for bringing that up.
There we go. So, technology really changed immensely in my entire career. And I've been working in IT for 40 plus years. So when I first started working, there were no personal computers. There were no cell phones. So the mobility of technology was limited. But as, personal computers were introduced into the workplace, mobile devices were introduced into the workplace, the access grew from 8 to 5 to 24/7, and grew from within, maybe 2 time zones, 3 time zones within the US to globally. And over time, new tools and new technologies were introduced because of that mobility. Tools like telepresence, Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and GoToMeetings, collaboration tools, and YouTube have all been technology changes that have really impacted the way we work, the way we communicate, more than anything else over the past 30 years.
Bluntly put, cell phones make this easier or more challenging?
Cell phones make, I think, working easier, but it makes work more challenging because, again, your day has changed potentially from 8 to 5 to there is no work day. It's unlimited. And obviously with, cell phones and the ability to get email has translated in from a communication methodology to a to-do list, more or less. And you're constantly getting emails at any time of the day or night, especially if you're working in a global team or a global environment for a global company, because Italy is 6 hours ahead of us. So when I worked at GE and I was part of a global team and managed global people globally, my cell phone was blowing up at 5 o'clock in the morning because it was, 10 o'clock in Italy, and I was getting emails from my team constantly. Conversely, India is 14 hours ahead of us on the other side of the globe. So what technology has done is it's reduced time zones, and it's made our workday almost seem non-ending at certain points in time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, and you can certainly give us the lesson of don't practice don't practice what you're preaching, or practice what you preach, or, do as I say, not as I do. But, do you check emails after 5? Do you have a clock out time? And you say, I've got to put the devices away, even though I haven't really left a working space, because I think a lot of us tend to think of that routine, that we leave the office, the workday is done, we head home, we do something different. How do you find yourself interacting with that after hours?
To my wife's dismay, I'm checking emails at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. if I wake up and I just grab my phone, which is on the next to the bed, and I'm looking at emails. I'm looking for fires. I'm looking for, issues, depending upon, who that's coming from and what it is. 80% of the emails are informational only, and potentially you don't even need to be on the distribution. But I'm looking for issues, and it's just become a habit now. There are times when I just shut down, turn off, and don't pay attention to the phone. But that's you have to discipline yourself to do that.
And I think that at the very least, it turns you into a little bit more of a math wizard when it comes to figuring out time zones and operating around that. At least for me, because as we navigate the digital space, I've been fortunate to connect with some folks throughout the country, seeing what they're doing, sharing a little bit about what we're doing. I became pretty aware that prior, when I'm sending an email, I think of the workday in my own context of what it means to be 9 o'clock Eastern time, and not thinking about times on the West Coast or times in the heartland of America. How do you find when you're having these conversations and trying to meet up with other people? Are you bending more to Italy's time? Is Italy bending more to your time? Are you trying to meet somewhere in the middle where, it might be a little earlier than you wish, but a little later than they wish? So it's a back and forth. How do you negotiate that when you're working with a global team?
It, it goes both ways. I definitely, when I'm scheduling meetings, I'm cognizant of time zone. So I schedule what's at most convenient to the people that I'm requesting to be on the call. Um, there are cases where, teams that I've worked with have worked our time zone. So I had a team in India that was working our 8 to 5. So they were working from roughly, I believe, 5 or 6 in the afternoon to midnight, or maybe 1 in the morning.
Oh,
But
wow.
that was part of the responsibility and the engagement. When I was dealing with Europe, I was definitely cognizant of their time zone. Wouldn't schedule anything post 1 o'clock in the afternoon because that was 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening for them. So and they were viewing it the same way. I mean, they weren't scheduling meetings with us at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. So it's just a matter of respect and convenience on both sides.
On the other side of that coin, I want to talk a minute about the ability to plug in, because I think we talked about the challenges of unplugging and being able to step away, but to me, routine has just seemed so critical to work. Wake up, make coffee, get ready, commute, plug in and go. That's all different now. I think most impacted by the we're not commuting aspect of shifting a space or place. Um, I dare say that it's easier to, wake up slow, watch a little bit more TV, and then scramble to hit the plug in button and be ready. And I think, other folks are experiencing that too. Um, what do you do to find to be effective when it comes to managing yourself? Because you talked about productivity being that positive, so plugging in and making sure that, you're actually committed to the work, and because the refrigerator's not, because it's there, you're not walking to it, and because the TV's not there, it's not also playing in the background, where you're distracted from that. So what do you find to be effective managing yourself, staying disciplined, communicating effectively?
Well, I do think there's a difference. I think there's a difference between someone like myself who knew going in that I was going to be working remotely versus the individuals and the people that are working remotely because of the virus. Um, and that's been thrust upon them almost overnight. So I think it's a different response. My routine developed over time, and I agree with you. There are distractions. I mean, I found myself wanting to go out and cut the grass rather than attending a call because it just seemed to be therapeutic to me to go out and cut the grass than talk to somebody on the other side of the globe about a business issue. But over time, I found that my routine is I like to plug in early because I can get things done before 8 o'clock, before people start calling and emailing and pinging and chatting. But there are challenges because you really feel alone, right? You need to, we're all human. We all need to be accepted. And you really miss that contact. You miss that physical contact. And I'm sure that's part of what people are going through now that they've been, a month away from the workplace, possibly. There's a lot to be said for face to face, eye contact, body language, and things of that nature to see, responses. So the challenge is, not being involved. And I had a situation where when I was first started working remotely, I was working for another person, and I really thought that this individual wasn't totally utilizing my talents. I wasn't being given enough work. I didn't feel that she was involving me enough, and I began to get paranoid because I'm thinking, all right, if they don't need me, am I going to get laid off? Am I going to get let go? So I solved that problem by every time I talked to this individual, I volunteered. I volunteered to do whatever. I said, give me the hardest stuff that you have. I want to be your go-to person. I want to be the first person that you think of when, you know, a problem comes down the road. And that really drove the clarity of our relationship, and it developed a relationship with my manager. Now, that was obviously increased and emphasized various times during the year when we did get together in certain locations, or we had meetings in Cincinnati or Houston or Atlanta. But the relationship was really built through that remote communication. The challenge there is, you know, you might think you're doing the right thing on a piece of work, but because you're not co-located, you need to ensure that you have the right direction and the expectations are clear, and it's all about communication and talking and discussing with that individual.
So Mark, one of the questions we got in advance from somebody tuning in was, you know, I think right to this point, which is, does it always have to be a video conference? Because I think what you touched on is great in that, you know, the idea of the missed contact and how much of our communication is visual, you know, aside from what it is we're saying, but how we're emoting, how we look during that, and certainly video calls try to get close to that, but are no perfect substitution. But, you know, for those feeling like it's always got to be a video call, where now we've got to at least put a shirt on and you know, fix our hair a little bit as best we can. Does it always have to be video? How do you navigate that in deciding the calls of this needs to be a video call or this just can be an audio call? Give us some insight on the, you know, best practices for that.
So that's a great question, because when I first started working remotely, video was non-existent. Everything was audio. And it was on, you know, some conference call technology that at times was pretty poor. So it's the art of communication. It's the art of talking to someone and making sure that your message is clear and making sure that your message is to the point, whether it's asking questions or whether it's assigning a task. So I did quite a number of presentations that were strictly audio based, you know, audio based like we are here, sharing a screen, but absolutely no video. And people would come back to me and say, you know, that was a great presentation. How do you do it? And I said, you know, you really got to practice. You have to practice communicating that message. So same thing when you're meeting with your manager or meeting with one of your team members or subordinates. When you're talking one-on-one, you have to really hone in on the message that you want to deliver, almost to the point where sometimes you have to write it down beforehand and go through it to make sure that you are delivering the right message and communicating correctly. That's why you know, text messaging and sometimes emails totally get misunderstood, misconstrued, because it's off the cuff, it's immediate, and you're writing something and someone's looking at it and they're not getting the point that you were driving, or they totally misunderstood it. So that's why verbal communication is so important.
Well, and I think too, to that point of just being able to follow up, yeah, I think maybe many of us just take communication for granted in the traditional workspace. But now, you know, I think it's that, you know, ensuring that the clarity is there, you know, and repeating back what we heard from someone else, or asking them to repeat what, you know, we've possibly said, and, you know, making sure that everybody leaves on the same page. From the manager's perspective, because Mark, you talked about, you know, one of the ways that you navigated this, you know, when you felt, you know, somewhat alone or isolated, that you just began volunteering for projects. You know, put me on this, give me your hardest stuff. You know, I want to work. From a manager's standpoint, I highly doubt that the yous of the world are alone right now, and a lot of people are probably trying to step up to the plate and prove their resourcefulness and their usefulness. How do you, as a manager, what do you guide? How do you guide people in navigating that when it comes to delegating tasks to your team, and then making sure that one team member's not pulling 80% of the yoke, that, you know, the rest of your team's only taking 20% and they're doing just fine with that? How do you navigate that as a manager?
I think, and this is my personal opinion, I think you have to start by developing a relationship with that person. You have to understand that person. And even when I had teams in India that were working for me that I had never met before, only on a conference call. And they were contractors, they were not GE employees. But I took the time to talk to these people and understand a little bit about their background, a little bit about their families, where they came from. I tried to show some interest in them as a person, but I wanted to understand their capacity, how much they could, how willing they were to take on more work and to do work, understand, their level of knowledge, what they could perform. Obviously, a lot of that came from as we worked together and we were giving them tasks and they accomplished them or didn't accomplish them. But I think it's important to develop that relationship, because then you develop their trust and you can understand from them whether or not they want more work, whether or not they have the bandwidth to take more work, whether or not they have the psyche to be able to deal with the stress. So that was the approach that I took. And then, I did the same thing with, I had employees in Italy that I had, that worked for me that I had never met until I took a personal trip back in 2017 and actually got to meet these guys face to face, and gals. So, um, I,
I think that that's one of the exciting things we're all looking forward to is the folks that we're connecting with, when we can meet them, but having to navigate that. And I think that what you touched on are the same feelings that other people are having on the other line. That we're all feeling the same sort of possible anxiety around this, or just the challenges. And so I think it really is that honest, open communication. I think is a great way to key in on that. We talked about distractions that perhaps are self-made. In the refrigerator's calling my name, or I might want to cut the lawn instead of taking a call. But I mean, it seems like it was forever ago, and I know it was just a couple of years, but we all became aware of BBC Dad, where a child came into an office during an interview that a certain expert was having with BBC. And we got to see the kid and the second kid and the partner, rush in to sort of get them out of the home office. Just the other day in the New York Times, Claire Kane Miller put, with children popping into Zoom meetings, it's impossible to hide that raising children is a round-the-clock responsibility. And so I've got to ask what kind of advice you have for those who are suddenly working remotely, but then also parenting, and that's not happening remotely, because now we've got families all together where, we're also working on trying to educate our children, who are learning remotely. Parents, it's challenging. And I say that from the perspective, I don't have kids of my own that I'm taking care of. I'm not juggling that, but I know many of my friends are. And so what advice do you give to them when it comes to juggling the work remote now, trying to plug into a work day, and then also help your children learn and realize they're not going to school. They're there in the house with you, or the apartment with you, or wherever it is you may be.
yeah, I've been on numerous calls the past 3 to 4 weeks with team members where they have had to apologize because their 3-year-old ran into the room screaming and yelling, and they immediately go on mute, and then you don't hear their response, and then they get on and apologize. It's just the sign of the times, and you have to be understanding and deal with it. I think a recent event shows kind of a unique response. The NFL draft, which was conducted digitally. And I didn't watch it. I followed it on my phone, specifically looking for the team that I follow and who they were drafting. But everything that I've read afterwards, they were showing, I think they were streaming it, and I'm not sure if they were streaming it through ESPN, but they were showing different coaches in their homes. And many of the coaches had their children sitting next to them or sitting on their lap as their teams were making picks. And the response back was how humane that was. So I don't believe it to be a problem or an issue at all. And I don't really think someone who's parenting, children who are at home right now needs to apologize when they're on a conference call. And, like I said, their 3-year-old comes running in and screaming, and you hear them in the background on a conference call or a Zoom call. So
It's a great reminder that life happens, and I think that that's one of the really interesting things that, at least for me, I'm getting a better sense of, is that this, I think, gives us a little clearer of a window into our coworkers' personal lives, because rather than
Exactly.
meeting around a conference table, we're suddenly in their space. And I mean, both of us right now have virtual backgrounds up, and some of the platforms allow for that, some do not. But there is this sort of invasion into the personal space, and I find that absolutely fascinating. I know there have been a ton of different articles I've seen now of how to stage your background for a Zoom call, and I'm not sure I necessarily believe in that, of putting the plant to the right or the left, or that that's one of the more important things. But for you, somebody who's done this now for a decade and a half, how do you navigate that, of what personally allows to come into the workspace now that somebody's connecting with you digitally into your area, into where it is you are, and you're connecting into theirs? How do you navigate that together? Because I think you were so kind in the humane response with the NFL draft, as that example with kids. So what recommendations do you have in terms of creating a little bit of that separation, so that we're not peering into the souls of our homes when it comes to us working together?
That's a tough question, I think, Ben. I mean, if I had, and I have three children, but they're all grown and they're out of the house, obviously. But if they were home during this, I think you have to communicate to them that there's time where you need to be alone, you need to be on calls, you need to be working. I think that's the question you're asking me, but I'm not
Yeah.
entirely 100%
Well,
positive.
that too, but I think that from the sense of just the invasion of space, and not necessarily in a negative way, that I'm seeing a different Mark Squeglia that I'm used to right now. Like I said, I know we have the virtual backgrounds, but you're in your home, I'm in mine. Normally, we're gathered in the Jefferson. We've both opted for the virtual background. So just looking at how do you navigate letting too much of the personal life in, or too much of your own space in, as people are now connecting, where we're seeing each other in maybe our more natural habitats.
I don't limit it. I mean, and it's nothing that I have apprehension over. So I've pretty much opened it up totally. I mean, I don't see it as a problem, or I don't see it as something that is going to prevent me from joining a video call or anything like that.
So I think it's certainly a glass house moment for us all. Let's talk about some buzzwords: goals, objectives, expectations, tasks, one-on-ones. Those are all words we use in the workspace and the workplace. How do those change when it comes to working remotely?
Well, they don't change, because if you're co-located, these things all should have been done through your normal day-to-day work. So if I'm a manager, I should be giving my workers goals and objectives. I should be making sure they understand the expectations. I should be reviewing on a daily basis what they're working on. We should have set up, if they're working in a technological setting, we could set up work queues for them, work that they're assigned to do over a period of time. And we should be meeting with them one-on-one to understand whether or not they're getting those tasks accomplished. If they aren't, what's blocking them from getting those tasks accomplished? I don't think that changes if you're working remotely. Yeah, you may need to use some tools because you are remote, and you can't sit down next to someone and say, look, these are the 6 things on paper that you were supposed to do yesterday. Where are they? So you can use some technological tools to do that. But it's the same thing. You need to communicate verbally, communicate, remotely. What are the goals and objectives of you as an individual, and you as a member of a team? You need to understand what those expectations are. If they're not being clearly enumerated, they need to be recommunicated so that the person understands. Same thing with the daily work tasks. And the work queues is just merely a way of delivering the work. One-on-ones is kind of like a GE term, and we use that kind of universally. Um, I had one-on-ones with all of my employees, and I had one-on-ones with my managers. funny thing is, when I had my one-on-one with my last manager, we ended up talking about her family, my family, personal things, more than we talked about work things, because outside of the one-on-one, we had communicated so well and so often that we didn't need to talk about work issues. So that just really, those one-on-ones really solidified that relationship and that trust. And funny thing is, we're still communicating with each other, and I've been gone for over almost a year now. In fact, we had a virtual happy hour on Zoom about a week ago with a lot of my GE colleagues, ex-GE colleagues.
Well, and I think that's one of the great things we're seeing with the technology here is the ability to gather folks, even just socially. We started this off talking about, the feelings of isolation, or that, the distancing is actually starting to weigh on us and our connections, and that we desire that. Question from the audience, Mark, how do you help, those who have now been thrust into this new work environment, where the technology is a challenge for them? And so talking a little bit about the digital divide in terms of, folks knowing how to, operate in this capacity, answer a Zoom call, host a Zoom meeting, start to set up a lot of that. This is uncharted foreign territory for a lot of folks. For those that might feel a little bit embarrassed about that, or that they're having a, slower time taking to the new tech, what recommendations, tips, and tricks do you have for them?
I don't know if I have any tips or tricks. I wonder if my wife posts that question though. But first of all, there's no dumb questions. There should be no embarrassing questions. Technology is challenging at times. Zoom, when we first started using it, was a challenging tool. But you can't break anything. Try it, right? Go in there and go into the drop downs on Zoom and try what we did before we got on this call. You and I did. We got onto Zoom and we went through all the drop downs, making sure everything was working. That's what I would suggest to anybody, whether it's GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, whatever. People have taken to social media. How did they take to social media? They went in and they started trying things and they found that it worked. The other thing is, if you work for a company that has an IT support organization, those people are more than willing and will, assist and help remotely. That's one of the things that IT has been doing for years and years and years. So there are no, and I can understand where people get maybe technology intimidates them, but the cell phone is technology, and it seems like the entire society has taken to cell phones with no issues.
I think that's a great point, Mark. And I think that, it's at least for me, perhaps analogous to if I'm having a face-to-face meeting, I'm still preparing for it. Yeah, I'm going
Mhm.
through my notes, putting together my thoughts, and I'm gathering whatever folders I need to carry in. Now we're just doing that in a digital space, and the tools are a little bit different, but they're still tools, and we can reach out. And I think that's a great point of being able to ask for that help and look for support within your organization, or if your organization contracts another company to ask for that support. I want to go back to the conversation and dialogue between an employee and the boss. And I think it's some of us are used to we walk into the boss's office, we have a meeting in the office, and there's the clear social cue that the meeting's over. We stand up when we leave the office. Now we're doing that digitally. So talking to the boss, what do you recommend here? You've got a great list. Let's go through it.
I think the first thing is the way the environment maybe was, where the individual expected the boss to approach them. And I don't think that works in a remote environment. You need to reach out to your boss. You need to schedule conversations with that person, but you also need to have ad hoc conversations with that person. So if you're working on something and you don't understand it, or you have questions, and instead of waiting or sending an email, depending upon the severity of that issue, you need to call the boss and talk to them. what I found is what I mentioned earlier is, develop relationships. Discuss non-work items. If you've never met that person before and you're working remotely, that's a must. If you already have a relationship with that person because you were co-located, that may not be so imperative. But if you get to know each other, if you get to know the person's personality, you get to know what trips they're triggered, you get to know what may upset them or may not upset them. I think that just helps you daily as you move forward. Um, the other thing is you need to understand and know what a severe issue is, specifically remotely. So if you can understand the process and know what's going on, and reach out to that individual and tell them that you'll take care of the fire that's currently going on, that improves that relationship, but it also improves that level of communication between the two people. And then you need to let that person know if they're piling work on, you need to let that person know how much bandwidth you have. I mean, there's many people that will not ever say no, and they take on too many things, and then they're not able to accomplish it, and then they get themselves into further trouble. So you need to understand what your bandwidth is, more so remotely than when you're co-located, because you don't have that spontaneous interaction with that person. And then your boss has to help you reprioritize when you have, way too many things on your plate. So then it comes back to, that level of communication.
Well, so let's flip that coin, Mark. And when you're the boss and you're talking to your team, either collectively or you're in the one-on-one, which we mentioned earlier, most important things to consider and best practices, go.
So what we practiced, and first of all, on the screen is a pictorial of representative of the team I had in my last couple of years at GE. I was sitting here in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I had team members that were located in Houston, in Malaysia, a couple in Germany, the UK, New Orleans, India, and Italy. So I was communicating with all those team members every day during the week, not all at the same time, but at different points in time. And we had what we were calling a daily scrum call, 15 minutes every morning, get on the phone, get on a video conference or get on an audio conference and talk about what are you doing today? What did you do yesterday? And what's blocking you from accomplishing what you said you were going to do today? And sometimes those calls lasted longer than 15 minutes. Sometimes those people didn't have any issues, but it solidified and it made that level of communication between manager and employee and manager. It had it and it standardized it every day. Then additionally, we had staff meetings where we would talk about bigger issues than just the daily tasks. We would schedule one-on-ones, which I indicated before, and that was the opportunity to talk to people and say, look, your performance on this issue maybe wasn't what it should be. And instead of saying, hey, you did a bad job and you shouldn't be doing that anymore, we used what we call the continue and consider philosophy. If they didn't do something that you felt was adequate, you asked them to consider approaching that problem in a different manner. Or if what they did was a good job and you say, yeah, that was a great piece of work on that task, you got to, whatever process you use to accomplish that, continue that on other things. But you need to understand how far you can push people. I mean, there are people, like I said earlier, that you can just keep dumping work on them. They will not say no. And those prior calls that I mentioned, the one-on-one or the daily scrum call, is the chance for them to say, hey, boss, I can't do any more. And then you got to reprioritize. And that all will make the team better, because if you have that empathy and you have that willingness to listen to their issues, that'll make the entire team better. The other thing
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, the other thing in this scenario where I had team members, in Europe and in Asia, you need to be aware of the global nature, which we talked about earlier about time zones, but you also need to be aware of cultural impact in the countries that they're coming from. Certain things you say, certain things that you do aren't socially accepted in certain countries. The Indian culture is totally different. I respect it immensely. I have many good friends that I only met on audio conference calls that are now people that I communicate and talk to regularly. But you need to be aware of the cultural differences. And, there are times, and I've heard occasions where we feel that our way is the best way, and we impose our will and maybe our culture on people because we're not very patient. Um, but I have that bullet point down there, don't be the ugly American, which I think runs true. So.
Well, I think that's a really important point. I think the mindfulness of work and how we're working with others and how we're taking others into consideration. Mark, we're almost out of time here, and I just want to do a quick recap of if we had to do the takeaways, which you've so greatly put on the screen there. Let's run through those real quickly for anybody tuning in, who really needs to make sure they take away the high points of what it is we've been talking about.
Sure. So, I think people can see the screen, but frequent and constant communication is key, and it's imperative, because what that communication drives, it drives the understanding of expectations. You need to know what is expected of you. You also need to communicate so that you know and agree upon the objectives that you're trying to drive to. That communication drives regular feedback. I was constantly asking for feedback, both me as a manager and me as an employee to a manager. We talked a little bit about continue and consider, being less harsh on telling people you're doing a bad job or you're doing a great job. You specifically you need to get to know your team. You need to understand those people. You need to know what makes them up and develop relationships with them. And a couple of things that I added here towards the end when I went back and looked at these slides is for the people that are new to working remotely, you need a comfortable workspace because that drives so much of your performance and your productivity. If you're working in an uncomfortable workspace, that makes it difficult to work remotely. And you need to have reliable communications, internet access, and voice communications. So those are, I feel, the key takeaways from what we've talked about over the last hour.
Right. I think that's a great note to end on. And I think one of the things too that, is so important to acknowledge in this conversation is how much this does depend on reliable communication tools. And so making sure you have access to internet as well as phone. And we know certainly not everybody does. And that's been a challenge when it comes to shifting to digital work amidst the COVID-19 crisis. That's another conversation for another day, which we will have. But Mark Squeglia, a fantastic historian helping us navigate the future now. Thank you for taking the time to join us for Jefferson Programming today.
Thanks, Ben.
And thank you to all who are watching along at home, either live with us on the Jefferson's Facebook page or watching a rebroadcast of this on our YouTube account. We thank you so much for tuning in. To find out more information about both upcoming programs as well as Jefferson publications, please do visit our website, www.jeserie.org. And like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today.